Barbarian! Look out!
Love built his empire, and it would be the end of him.
She was the kind of woman men wrote songs about and killed for. When she walked into his life, the city started to bleed in her name. Stay till the end to see how love built an empire and destroyed it just as fast. They say every empire starts with a story. Some begin with a gun, some with a dream, and some with a heartbeat in the dark. The city slept under a blanket of smoke and neon. Rain fell in slow motion, drumming on rooftops and washing the blood from the sidewalks that never truly stayed clean. In a narrow alley behind a flickering bar sign, a boy named Vince Moretti learned his first lesson. The world doesn't give, it takes. He was 9 when he saw his father get beaten for refusing to pay protection money. The gangsters didn't even bother to hide their faces. They laughed as they worked. Leather gloves stained red, boots pressing into the dirt. His mother screamed, clutching Vince, whispering prayers that never reached heaven. That was the night innocence died in his eyes. From then on, Vince wasn't scared of the dark. He studied it. He grew up in the underbelly of the city, working odd jobs in smoke-filled bars and cheap restaurants where the real deals happened in the back rooms. He learned to listen more than he spoke. The men who ruled the city didn't notice him, not yet, but he noticed everything. The way they dressed, the way they ordered respect, and the way they looked at fear as if it were currency. By 17, Vince had already learned the language of survival: quiet loyalty, quick fists, and the art of making friends in dangerous places. But what separated him from the rest was his restraint. He wasn't reckless, he wasn't loud. He watched, planned, waited. Patience became his weapon, but fate, as it always does, had a cruel sense of timing. It was a cold evening in the winter of 1978 when she walked into the picture, Evelyn Rousseau. She wasn't from the streets. She didn't belong in a world of smoky bars and bruised knuckles. She was elegance wrapped in mystery, a French-Italian singer who could stop a room with one note. When she sang, even the toughest men forgot how to breathe. Her voice didn't just echo. It lingered, wrapping itself around your bones like a secret you didn't want to let go of. Vince saw her perform for the first time at a club owned by the Luciano Syndicate. He wasn't supposed to be there, just a runner delivering cash envelopes. But when she stepped under the spotlight, time slowed. The cigarette smoke curled in the air like a halo above her, and Vince realized something dangerous. Beauty could be just as powerful as bullets. After the show, he caught her outside, lighting a cigarette under the flickering street lamp. She had that look, the kind that said she'd seen too much but still dared to smile. "You don't look like you belong here," he said. She smirked, blowing smoke into the cold. "Neither do you." That was their beginning. Not a romantic one, not yet. Just two lost souls orbiting around the same dangerous world, pretending they had control. Evelyn had come to the city running from her past. Whispers of a lover who disappeared in Paris. Debts she didn't owe but still paid for. Vince never asked too many questions. In their world, curiosity was a death wish. Over the next few months, he found reasons to visit the club more often. Sometimes he'd watch from the back, sometimes from the corner of the bar, always unnoticed by the crowd, but never by her. Slowly, silently, they began to share something unspoken, a connection built on glances and half-truths. One night, after her performance, she found him waiting outside again. This time she wasn't smiling. "They say you work for the Lucianos," she said quietly. "I do odd jobs," Vince replied, eyes steady. "They're dangerous men." "So am I," he said, though deep down he wasn't sure if he meant it yet. That night, they shared their first kiss in the back of a rain-soaked alley, not out of love, but out of loneliness. Two broken people trying to find warmth in a city that had forgotten what kindness felt like. But love, or whatever it was, made Vince reckless. He started taking bigger risks, making small-time deals behind the Lucianos' back, dreaming of one day having enough money to leave it all behind. Evelyn became his muse, the calm to his chaos, the dream that made the dirt of his life seem almost golden. Yet dreams in the underworld are just traps with better lighting. The Lucianos found out. Not about the deals, not yet, but about Evelyn. She had caught the eye of Don Salvatore Luciano, the head of the family himself. He wanted her to sing at his private parties, to entertain his guests. Vince couldn't say no, but every night she sang for the Don. A fire grew inside him, a fire made of jealousy, pride, and fear. One night, Vince followed the Don's men to a private gathering in the hills. He watched from the shadows as Evelyn performed in front of the city's most powerful criminals, her eyes empty, her smile forced. When Salvatore reached out to touch her cheek, Vince's blood turned cold. That was the night the gangster in him was born. The boy who once watched his father beaten in the street no longer existed. Something darker took his place, something colder, sharper, and ready to strike. He began planning in silence, using every connection he had built over the years. Small-time hustlers, crooked cops, black market traders. Piece by piece, he gathered a network. Not for power, not yet, but for freedom. His freedom. Evelyn's freedom. When he finally made his move, it was like watching a storm unfold in slow motion. The club burned that night, a fire so bright it lit up the entire block. No one knew who did it. The Lucianos lost money, territory, and face. Vince disappeared. Evelyn vanished with him. The newspapers called it an accident. The streets called it a message. In a rented room above a forgotten diner miles outside the city, Vince and Evelyn watched the flames from the window. She held his hand, trembling. "What have you done?" she whispered. "Started something," he replied, eyes still fixed on the horizon. "Something they'll never forget." In that moment, they weren't fugitives. They were legends in the making. What neither of them knew then was that love, the same love that gave Vince purpose, would one day be the reason he lost everything. But for now, under that burning sky, they believed in the lie that every gangster tells himself before the fall, that he can control the fire he started. The fire that consumed the Luciano Club wasn't just a blaze. It was a declaration. Every flame whispered Vince Moretti's name, even if no one dared to say it aloud. In the shadows of that destruction, a legend began to take shape. Vince didn't plan on becoming a gangster. He planned on surviving. But survival has a way of demanding more, and in time, survival turned into ambition. He and Evelyn hid out in an abandoned motel on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where the paint peeled like old skin and the wind carried the sound of sirens from miles away. They lived on canned food and stolen whiskey, but there was something romantic in the desperation. Evelyn would hum old jazz tunes while he mapped out his next move on a torn piece of cardboard, using cigarette burns as markers for enemy territory. They had nothing, but Vince had a vision. The Lucianos were bleeding. The fire had destroyed not just their club, but their reputation. Smaller gangs, the Rossi, the Belmonts, the Caldarellis, all started circling like vultures. Vince saw the chaos for what it was, an opportunity. He started small, gathering a crew of outcasts who, like him, had been used and discarded by the city's power players. There was Marco Knives Bellini, a street brawler with scars across his knuckles and a grin that never reached his eyes. Tommy Vance, an ex-cop kicked off the force for taking bribes. And Luca D'Amato, a forger so talented he could copy a priest's handwriting or a politician's signature in minutes. They met in basements, warehouses, and abandoned train cars, planning, scheming, building. Vince wasn't the loudest or the meanest, but he had something the others didn't: control. He never raised his voice, never showed fear, and never acted without reason. In a world of chaos, he became a man of precision. And through it all, Evelyn stayed by his side. She was more than his muse now. She was his anchor, his reason, his shadow. She helped him think like the enemy. Her time among the Lucianos had taught her how men of power moved, how they lied, and how they trusted the wrong people. "Charm them," she told Vince one night, pouring whiskey into a chipped glass. "You can't beat them with bullets alone. You have to make them want to follow you." He took her advice to heart. Within months, Vince was no longer just a name whispered in alleyways. He was a force. His crew started taking over the city's gambling dens, then the docks, then the trucking routes that moved the city's black market goods. He didn't take everything by force. Sometimes he'd walk into a rival's place, sit down at their table, and talk them into joining him. It wasn't fear that made men follow Vince Moretti. It was belief. He made them feel like part of something bigger than survival, part of a movement. But every empire built in the dark needs fuel, and theirs came in the form of a heist that would change everything. Word spread of a secret cash shipment moving through the harbor. Millions in untraceable bills meant to fund Luciano operations overseas. No one dared to touch it. The docks were crawling with guards, and every gangster in the city knew the Don would slaughter anyone who tried. But Vince didn't see danger. He saw destiny. For weeks, he and his crew planned every detail. The shift changes, the patrol routes, even the tides. Evelyn played her part too, cozying up to one of Salvatore's lieutenants to gather intel. It was a dance of deception, one that kept her awake at night and Vince pacing the floor in silence. The night of the heist was a storm. Fitting, Vince thought, as rain lashed against the docks and thunder rolled across the sky. Dressed in black, his crew moved like ghosts. Knives cut the power lines. Tommy took out the guards. Luca forged the transport papers. Within 20 minutes, they had the cash loaded into 2 trucks and disappeared into the night. No one died. No alarms were raised, just silence. Cold, perfect silence. By dawn, every street in the underworld was buzzing with the same question. Who pulled it off? When Vince's men started flashing new watches and new cars, the answer spread like wildfire. And with it came a new nickname whispered in back rooms and bars, the Gentleman Ghost. For a time, life was good. Vince and Evelyn moved into a penthouse overlooking the city, far from the filth of their beginnings. He dressed in tailored suits now, spoke with quiet authority, and dined with men who once would have spat at his shoes. Evelyn performed again, not in smoky bars but at private gatherings filled with money, wine, and fear. But with power came paranoia. The Lucianos wanted blood. The Don had doubled the bounty on Vince's head, and the FBI had started sniffing around his name too. The higher he climbed, the more enemies followed. Evelyn saw it first. The tension in his jaw, the sleepless nights, the way he'd stare out the window for hours as if waiting for someone to appear in the reflection behind him. "Promise me," she whispered one night as they lay in bed. "If it all starts to fall apart, we leave. Just you and me." He didn't answer. He just kissed her hand and stared at the ceiling, the city lights flickering across his face like prison bars. Power wasn't a crown. It was a curse. The deeper Vince went, the more he realized that crime wasn't just about control. It was about ownership. The city began to belong to him piece by piece, but each piece demanded a sacrifice. He watched friends turn into liabilities and allies turn into threats. Marco Knives got arrested after a street fight gone wrong. Tommy was shot by a rival gang. Luca vanished with a briefcase of money and was never seen again. Vince didn't mourn. He just grew colder, harder, quieter. Evelyn tried to reach him. But the man she'd loved, the one who once dreamed of escape, was fading behind the eyes of the kingpin he was becoming. One evening, she found him in his office, staring at the portrait of her he had commissioned months ago. "Do you even know why you started this?" she asked softly. He didn't look at her. "Because I wanted you to be safe." "And now?" "Now," he said, lighting a cigarette, "I want the whole city to know it." That was the night Evelyn realized something terrible. She had inspired not a man, but a monster. Still, she stayed. Not out of fear, but love, the kind of love that believes it can fix what's already burning. The city began to bow to Vince Moretti. His empire stretched from the docks to the casinos, from the alleys to the marble halls of politicians. But beneath the surface, something darker stirred. Betrayal was coming, and this time it wouldn't come from his enemies. It would come from the woman who had once been his reason to live. The city had a new ruler, and his name was whispered like a prayer or a curse. Vince Moretti. From the dockyards to the casinos, from the slums to the skyline, his reach was everywhere. Every club owner, every street hustler, every crooked cop knew the same truth. You could either work for Vince or disappear. But while most men built empires with blood and bullets, Vince built his with discipline. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't flaunt his wealth. He let silence and precision speak for him. His meetings were brief, his orders direct, and his punishments legendary. One mistake, one betrayal, and a man's life could vanish overnight, erased like chalk in the rain. And through it all, Evelyn was there, always there. She wasn't just his lover anymore. She was the face of his empire, the queen that softened his edges and sold his image to the world. Every time she walked into a room, men straightened their ties and lowered their voices. She turned fear into fascination, danger into allure. They called her the Muse. Together, they were unstoppable, a picture of power wrapped in elegance and secrecy. Vince ran the city's underground, while Evelyn hosted charity galas for the same high society that bought drugs and weapons from his men. They were the perfect illusion, beauty and brutality, working hand in hand. But beneath the champagne and chandeliers, cracks began to show. Power had changed Vince. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was control. Every move, every smile, every word around him was calculated. His charm became colder, his patience thinner. Evelyn saw it happen slowly, like watching the tide swallow the shore. He would come home late, smelling of smoke and gunpowder, his eyes distant. The man who once dreamed of freedom now dreamed only of domination. One night, during a private dinner in their penthouse, Evelyn tried to reach him. "Vince," she said, her voice soft, "you've got everything now. Why not stop?" He didn't even look up from his glass. "Stop?" he repeated. "You don't stop when you're on top. You stop when you're dead." Her silence lingered longer than his words. Outside, the rain fell against the glass, blurring the city lights, a reflection of the man she loved and the monster he had become. Still, the world loved the myth of Vince Moretti. He was seen as a modern Caesar, untouchable, unstoppable, and strangely poetic. The newspapers called him the gentleman ghost. Politicians dined with him in secret. Rival bosses paid him tribute. Even the cops took orders instead of giving them. But every empire built in shadows casts a long, dangerous shadow of its own. Vince's rise came at a cost. The old families, the Lucianos, the Rossi, and the Marinos, were growing restless. They watched him take their businesses, their men, their influence. What started as grudging respect began to twist into quiet hatred, and the first betrayal came from within. Marco Knives Bellini, Vince's oldest friend, had returned from hiding. He came to Vince claiming loyalty, saying he wanted back in. But greed is a language every gangster speaks fluently. Marco had struck a secret deal with the Lucianos, a promise of wealth and safety if he delivered Vince. Evelyn sensed it. She saw the way Marco avoided eye contact, the way his smile never reached his eyes. But Vince, blinded by history, refused to listen. "He's my brother," Vince said one night. "He wouldn't cross me." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. "You taught the city that everyone can be bought. Don't forget that your friends learned from you." Her warning came too late. One evening, during a warehouse meeting near the docks, Vince's convoy was ambushed. Gunfire tore through the air, sharp, merciless, echoing across the harbor. Vince's men fell one by one. The night was chaos, bullets, fire, betrayal. Vince survived, barely. A bullet grazed his shoulder and he escaped through the back alley, dragging himself into the freezing rain. When he returned to headquarters the next day, 3 of his lieutenants were dead. 1 was missing, and Marco was gone. The message was clear. The underworld was turning on him. Vince changed that night. Whatever soul remained in him burned away. He stopped trusting anyone. He moved Evelyn into a guarded mansion on the outskirts of the city. The laughter they once shared disappeared. Every conversation became strategy, every glance, suspicion. And yet, even in that growing darkness, their bond refused to break completely. Some nights, after the storm of business and blood, Vince would find her at the piano, her fingers drifting over the keys. He would stand behind her in silence, just listening. For a few minutes, the world would stop, but peace never lasts long in a kingdom built on fear. The Lucianos were regrouping, now led by the Don's ambitious nephew, Rico Luciano, younger, smarter, and far more ruthless than his uncle. Rico didn't want to rebuild the old ways. He wanted to destroy everything Vince had created and rule what was left, and he knew exactly how to break him. Rico approached Evelyn first. Not directly, and he sent letters. Subtle, elegant, taunting, each one reminding her of what Vince had become, of what she had lost. of the blood that now paid for her diamonds. You were his muse once, one letter said. Now you're just another painting on his wall. She burned the letters at first, but each one cut a little deeper, each word a mirror she couldn't look away from. Vince noticed the change, the way she flinched when he touched her, the distance in her voice, the questions she didn't ask anymore. One night, she confronted him, not with anger, but with quiet sorrow. "I didn't love a king, Vince," she whispered. "I loved a man, and I can't find him anymore." He turned away, his jaw tight. "The man you loved wouldn't have survived this world. Maybe that world isn't worth surviving." Her words hit harder than any bullet, but Vince didn't know how to stop. He was too far gone, too deep into the game to walk away. The Empire demanded constant feeding, money, loyalty, blood. And Evelyn, the woman who once inspired him, now stood at the edge of his world like a ghost, watching him become something unrecognizable. Then came the betrayal that would shatter everything. At a private meeting with his inner circle, Vince's enemies struck again, but this time from a place he never expected. The shipment route he had secured through the eastern docks, his most profitable operation, was leaked. The FBI raided it. Millions lost, men arrested, papers burned. Vince's rage was volcanic. He smashed glasses, overturned tables, demanded answers. Someone inside had sold him out. He interrogated everyone. But the truth, when it came, was worse than anything he imagined. It wasn't Marco this time. It wasn't a rival. It was Evelyn, not for money, not for revenge, but because she wanted out. She had gone to Rico, not knowing he would use her as bait. She thought she could negotiate peace, maybe an end to the war. Instead, Rico used her information to cripple Vince's empire and turn the city against him. When Vince found out, he didn't yell. He didn't hit her. He just stared, a silence so heavy it suffocated her. "Why?" he finally whispered, her eyes filled with tears. "Because I loved you enough to want to save you, and you loved power more than me." He walked out without another word. That night, the newspapers ran a new headline. "The Gentleman Ghost Vanishes, Empire in Flames." Vince Moretti was gone. The empire he built crumbled. His men scattered. The city, once his kingdom, now belonged to the vultures. And Evelyn Rousseau, the muse, the queen, the woman behind the Kingpin, disappeared into the same shadows that had once made her shine. But the story wasn't over. Because legends don't die, they wait. And somewhere, deep in the ruins of what once was, Vince Moretti was still breathing, plotting, remembering, and preparing for his return. The city had turned its back on him. Once, Vince Moretti's name carried the weight of thunder, a whisper that made men lower their voices and lock their doors. Now it echoed in empty streets like a ghost story mothers told their sons. His empire was gone, his allies scattered. His queen had betrayed him, though whether it was betrayal or mercy, even he couldn't decide. For weeks, Vince drifted through the ruins of his own kingdom, a man stripped of power, but not yet of purpose. He hid in safe houses, changing cars and faces, shaving his beard one day, growing it the next, always one step ahead of whoever still hunted him, the feds, the Lucianos, maybe even his own conscience. But it was silence that haunted him the most. He had lived his entire life surrounded by noise, the clink of glasses, the laughter of liars, the thud of money bags dropped on tables. Now all that was gone. What remained was the hollow sound of his own breathing and the steady tick of a cheap motel clock counting down the seconds to his inevitable end. He replayed everything in his mind. The rise, the glory, the love, the fire. It was like watching a film reel unwind, each frame sharper than the last. And in every frame she was there, Evelyn, his muse, his curse, his reason for everything. He wondered if she still sang somewhere, if she still looked over her shoulder at night, if she ever thought of him when the city lights went dim. But nostalgia doesn't keep a man alive. After a month in hiding, Vince resurfaced, not as a king returning to his throne, but as a ghost crawling out of his grave. The docks that once carried his shipments now belonged to Rico Luciano. The casinos that once paid him tribute had his face pinned to their walls, labeled wanted, dead, or alive. He was a walking target. Still, somewhere inside him, the flame refused to die. It flickered, faint, weak, but alive. Revenge wasn't just a desire anymore. It was the only thing keeping him breathing. Vince started small again, just like before. He found two old loyalists, Silvio Greco, a mechanic who had fixed his getaway cars back in the early days, and Rosa Valente, a former nightclub hostess who had once ferried messages between gangs. They owed him favors. They gave him shelter, food, and information. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Through whispers and coded letters, he began rebuilding his network. Not an empire this time, but a ghost army. The kind of operation that existed in shadows and struck when least expected. Silent hits, burned trucks, stolen shipments. Rico's men started disappearing. No one saw who did it. No one talked about who might be back. But everyone knew. The gentleman ghost had returned. But vengeance changes a man. It burns the edges of his soul until all that's left is smoke. Vince no longer fought for glory or pride. He fought to make sure no one, not Rico, not Evelyn, not the city, would ever forget who he was. Every move he made now was surgical, calculated, ruthless. He didn't trust anyone, not even those who swore loyalty. And the more he fought back, the more the city turned into a war zone. Gunfire in alleys, car bombs at dawn, blood in the gutters. The once luxurious skyline of Vince's empire was now dotted with fire, a grim reflection of the night it all began, years ago, when he burned the Luciano Club to ashes. Full circle, but this time there was no love to soften the flame. Evelyn's name still echoed in his head. He told himself she was dead to him, that she'd chosen her side. But when word reached him that she was seen performing again, this time at one of Rico's private parties, something in him snapped. He knew it was a trap. He knew Rico was baiting him, but Vince Moretti was never one to run from danger. That night, he came dressed like a ghost in the crowd. The club was filled with laughter and smoke, the same kind of haze that had started their story. On stage, Evelyn sang a slow, mournful tune, her voice trembling under the weight of the years between them. Her eyes found his in the crowd for just a second, and she faltered. Rico noticed, and in that tiny, fragile moment, the whole illusion shattered. Vince moved first. Rico's men reached for their guns, but by the time they did, the lights had gone out. Screams erupted. Glass shattered. The old rhythm of chaos, the one Vince knew too well, played again. When the lights came back, Rico lay on the floor, blood spreading across the marble. Evelyn stood frozen, tears cutting through her mascara, staring at Vince like she'd seen a ghost. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. "I never left," he said, voice low, raw. Before she could answer, the sirens wailed. Someone had called the cops. Vince turned to run, but she grabbed his arm. "Don't," she begged. "It's over." "It's never over," he said, but deep down, even he knew, it was. The police swarmed the place. Bullets tore through the air. Vince fought his way out, barely escaping into the rain-soaked streets. By dawn, the newspapers screamed, "Mob war erupts. Rico Luciano dead. Vincent Moretti alive." Alive, yes, but barely human. He fled the city once more, this time wounded, exhausted, and truly alone. Every safe house burned behind him. Every ally either dead or gone. And Evelyn, the one constant in his life, vanished again, leaving behind nothing but silence and the faint smell of her perfume in the air. Weeks turned into months. The city rebuilt itself, this time without kings. The underworld fractured into smaller pieces, like glass scattered across a floor no one dared to sweep. The name Vince Moretti became myth again, too dangerous to say, too tragic to forget. And in a small cabin far beyond the city limits, he watched the snow fall, alone, nursing the wound on his shoulder and the deeper one in his chest. He would never be the man he once was. Power had been his curse and love his punishment. Evelyn had tried to save him. Maybe she even did in her own way, by ending the dream before it consumed everything. In the stillness of that exile, he began to write. Not letters, not confessions, just words on old paper, his memories, his regrets, the truth of what power had cost him. Maybe someday someone would find it. Maybe it would all burn with him. It didn't matter anymore. He had built an empire for love and lost it for the same reason. And yet, as he stared out at the falling snow, he smiled faintly, the first real smile in years. Because for the first time since he was 9 years old, there was no blood on his hands. No deals to make, no enemies to kill, just silence. For a man like Vince Moretti, peace wasn't redemption. It was surrender. And surrender, finally, felt like freedom. But the city he left behind would never forget his story. In every alley, in every whispered deal, his legend lived on. The tale of the gangster who built a kingdom for love and lost it to his own reflection. The gentleman ghost had vanished once again, not in death, but in silence, and somewhere, perhaps in another dimly lit bar or smoky club, a woman's voice still carried his name through the night, softly, sadly, eternally. They still whispered her name in the back alleys of the city, like a forbidden prayer. Isabella Moretti, the woman who turned a street hustler into a king, and a king into a ghost. Her story didn't die with her lover. It lingered like perfume in the air, sweet and dangerous. Time had washed away the blood from the pavements, but not the memory of what she inspired. After Marco's empire fell, the city didn't heal. It adapted. New faces rose from the ruins, trying to rebuild the empire brick by brick, but none carried the same fire. The streets remembered his rules, his methods, his brutality, but more than that, they remembered her. Because even though Marco built the empire, Isabella gave it a soul, and later tore that soul apart. The reporters painted her as the mastermind behind the madness, the Eve in Marco's garden of crime. They called her manipulative, cunning, the real power behind the throne. But the truth was far messier than that. She hadn't asked for power, she had inspired it. She hadn't plotted Marco's fall, she had tried to save him from it. But the world never cared for truth. It cared for stories, and theirs was too cinematic to ignore. The ones who had known her said that after Marco's death, Isabella vanished. Some claimed she escaped to Italy under a false name. Others swore she was killed by the very men who once guarded her. But every few years, someone would swear they saw her, older, quieter, with eyes that had seen too much. Always near a church or sitting by the water as if waiting for a confession that would never come. The underworld changed without her, becoming colder, less human. Where Marco once ruled with a strange blend of loyalty and love, new bosses ruled with paranoia and fear. The code he built died with him, replaced by greed. And in that decay, people began to understand what his empire truly was. It wasn't built on money, guns, or blood. It was built on her. Decades later, a documentary crew would uncover their story again, digging through yellowed case files and half-burnt photos. They'd find a picture of Isabella standing beside Marco at a charity gala, smiling as if they were royalty. No one could deny their chemistry, two forces of nature drawn together by something neither could control. They weren't just in love. They were in orbit, doomed to collide. In one interview, an old detective recalled watching her during a police raid. She wasn't afraid, he said. She just stood there, hands clasped, eyes fixed on Marco as if nothing else in the world mattered. He remembered thinking, that's not the look of guilt or fear, that's devotion. And maybe that's what made her dangerous. Not her beauty, not her influence, but her capacity to love without measure. Some stories claim Isabella left behind a diary, a leather-bound book found in a burned-out villa by the sea. Most of it was unreadable, melted by the fire, but a few words survived on the last page. He wanted to own the world. I only wanted him to find peace. I guess neither of us got what we wanted. Those words became legend. They were printed on posters, quoted in novels, even romanticized in songs sung by crooners who never knew what they meant. But for those who did, those who lived through the chaos, they carried a weight. Because the truth behind them was carved in blood and silence. Marco's empire may have died, but its shadow remained. Every gang that rose after him used his tactics, his codes, even his myths. They called him the Ghost King and her the Muse. Together they were an archetype. Danger and desire fused into legend. They reminded people that empires built on emotion were just as dangerous as those built on ambition. In the end, Isabella became something larger than life, a symbol of how love could ignite an empire and burn it to ashes. Her story haunted every man who dreamed of power, every woman who fell for a man who carried a gun and a dream. Because she was proof that love, when mixed with power, becomes something neither divine nor human. It becomes history. Years later, a young man who had been a child during Marco's reign opened a small cafe on the same street where the first gunfight broke out. On the wall, he hung a framed black and white photo, Isabella in her silk dress, Marco at her side, both smiling like they had the world at their feet. When customers asked who they were, he'd just say, "They built this city once." Then they burned it down. He didn't tell them he'd been there that night. He didn't tell them he still heard the echo of gunfire in his dreams. Because in his eyes, they weren't monsters. They were a warning. A reminder that passion could be as lethal as greed, that every empire has a beating heart, and when that heart stops, everything crumbles. The legend of the gangster's muse still floats through the city like smoke from an old fire. Some remember her as a sinner, others as a saint. But to those who truly understood, she was neither. She was the spark that proved love and destruction often wear the same face. If you walk through the old districts at night, some say you can still see her shadow in the rain, standing beneath a flickering streetlight, waiting for a man who will never come. The kind of story the city doesn't forget, because it's written into its bones. And maybe that's the real lesson behind it all. Empires rise. Kings fall, but the muse, the woman who inspired it all, never truly disappears. She becomes legend,